Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today we are unpacking a really fascinating step-by-step historical narrative all about ancient spiritual warfare. We're going to be exploring some wild chronological claims regarding humanity's hidden past, uncovering a story that weaves together ancient texts, archaeology, and theology. Now, we aren't here to take sides on any of this. We're just here to walk you through the mystery and see what these sources actually say. Because, honestly, it's the ultimate historical mystery, right? What exactly was going on before the waters rose? If you look at ancient texts across the globe, they pretty much all point to a massive world-altering deluge. But the civilization that existed before that reset, well, that is where the story gets wildly unexpected. It honestly sounds a lot more like a dark ancient true crime thriller than your standard history lesson. Okay, let's dive right into this. To make sense of these claims, we're going to follow a macro timeline. We'll start way back in the deep pre-flood era, then move through the Great Flood itself, watch the rebuilding during the Bronze Age empires, and finally, we'll follow these exact same spiritual patterns all the way into our modern era. Step 1. The pre-flood world. It's interesting because both secular and biblical sources actually agree that a massive global disruption occurred roughly 10,000 years ago, likely linked to melting ice age glaciers that completely submerged ancient settlements. But the real question is, what kind of society was washed away? And this brilliantly illustrates the massive divide in how this ancient era is remembered. On one hand, according to pagan sources, the pre-flood world was this tragic loss, a literal golden age of high technology and spiritual magic. But the Book of Genesis recasts this era entirely. It claims this was absolutely not a utopia. Instead, it was a time of brutal tyranny, sheer chaos, and extreme wickedness. Moving on to step 2, creation of the Nephilim. The biblical texts point to a very specific, frankly terrifying group of beings who essentially dominated this pre-flood civilization. Now, you've probably heard the word Nephilim translated from Hebrew as giant, but the guest emphasizes that we really shouldn't just picture a really tall guy with a great bench press. Functionally, the term describes a thug, a bully, or an authoritarian dictator. And even more radically, the texts describe them as partly non-human hybrids, the offspring of spiritual entities and human women who were completely aligned with demonic spirits. So the absolutely crucial point here is how these Nephilim supposedly got all their power. The guest claims that in the ancient mind, technological advances, things like metallurgy, forging advanced weapons, and divination, they didn't come from human ingenuity. Nope. They were viewed as premature gifts from demonic spirits. It was secret knowledge handed to humanity way before we were spiritually mature enough to handle it, and the ultimate goal was basically our destruction. To really wrap our heads around how ancient people believed they communicated with these spirits, we have to look at the Greek concept of the nous, or the mind. The source explains that the ancients didn't see the brain as a computer that just generates thoughts out of nowhere. Instead, they viewed the mind as a sensory organ, kind of like an eye or an ear. In this worldview, humans don't actually generate ideas. We receive them from an external, spiritual realm. Which brings us to step 3, the Great Flood and post-flood empires. Driven by all this dark knowledge, humanity essentially reached peak wickedness, prompting God to wipe the slate clean with a cataclysmic flood, physically resetting the entire earth. But here is the massive cliffhanger for you. Did the Nephilim, or at least their spiritual influence, actually survive the flood? The physical world might have been washed clean, but according to the source, the spiritual world remained completely constant. And surviving humans, they immediately began trying to contact those exact same entities. Well, this introduces the concept of the Rephaim. These were believed to be the actual spirits of the dead, ancient pre-flood kings, the Nephilim. Post-flood Bronze Age empires, like Hammurabi's Babylon, actively sought to resurrect the power of these pre-flood rulers. They wanted that secret, destructive knowledge back, and they used some pretty dark rituals to get it. And the source maps out a global footprint for these practices that is just chilling. The ritual reproduction of kings through spiritual possession wasn't some isolated thing. The source points to the giant iron bed of King Og, which was identical to ritual beds found in Babylon used for temple prostitution. But it goes way further. We're talking about totally disconnected cultures, like the Khmer Empire in Cambodia, and even pre-World War II Japan, where the emperor ritually spent the night with the sun goddess. They all performed remarkably similar rituals to channel this spiritual power. Step 4. The anatomy of sin. Now we're going to shift from that macro-historical timeline right down to the microscopic, individual level. How exactly do ordinary humans fall into these ancient demonic patterns today? Let's move to how this builds, because it's a very specific progression. It starts simply enough. A thought enters the mind from the outside. If you entertain it, that thought turns into a plan. The plan becomes an action. Repeated actions form a habit. Over time, that habit takes total control, leading to what the ancients called the passions, which is basically a form of possession where you are no longer the one driving the bus. The final stage is just total, deliberate agreement with that evil spirit. And that brings us to this really striking quote from the 4th century figure St. John Chrysostom. He said, "It is people who live like demons who become demons." The core theological claim here is that repeatedly participating in evil isn't just a bad habit. It causes an actual, metaphysical transformation. You literally lose your humanity and become something else entirely. Step 5. The modern spiritual battle. Because, as the source argues, the ancient world didn't actually disappear, it just changed its clothes. Now, what's really interesting here is how the guest explicitly compares ancient pagan rituals to our modern secular institutions. For instance, he likens ancient temple prostitution to pervasive internet pornography, pointing out the tragic statistic that the average age of first exposure is now just 8 years old. He also compares appeasing ancient war gods to how modern politicians speak about the economy, as if it's this demanding deity we have to serve. And finally, he draws a direct line from human sacrifice to abortion and endless warfare, framing them as acts of violence committed simply to secure peace, prosperity, and power. So what is the source's antidote to all this hidden spiritual warfare? Well, it definitely isn't found in isolation, and you won't find it online. The guest insists that salvation requires submitting to a physical community. To break the cycle of these destructive habits, one must engage in deeply honest confession and fully integrate into an accountable, in-person church community where real human connections can finally replace spiritual isolation. Which leaves us with one final, pretty profound question to ponder. Are we living in the days of Noah? The source materials strongly suggests that our modern reliance on technology, our deep isolation, and our darkest habits might just be the exact same ancient forces repeating themselves all over again. It definitely makes you look at the news and human history in an entirely different light. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning what really lies beneath the surface of our world.